Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Simplifying Network Automation with NetGru. I'm your host, NetGru Adrian Liasiu. We have a special guest today, Claudia De Luna. Claudia, thank you so much for coming on. How are you? How have you been? I know you've been traveling a bit to LA. There's been some issues over there, as we all know. We had to push this live stream, by the way, from last week to this week. So I appreciate you folks joining us now here. So Claudia, yeah, how have you been
I'm
with
doing
all these
well.
things going on? Yeah,
There have been a lot of things going on. I'm a little dubious about 2025.
right.
Certainly, everybody may have heard about some tremendous fires down in the Los Angeles area. Um, lots of loss in every way, shape, or form. So yeah, I thank you for kind of pushing it back a week. I think that worked well for many for many people, I have to say.
Yeah, because we wanted to be mindful of all the tragedy that's going on over there, right? So yes, hopefully, the fires get contained and folks can go back and start rebuilding. Um, but for our live stream, right? We're on the tech side here. So tell us a bit about yourself. What do you do in your day to day job these
Absolutely.
days?
So I work for a company called EIA. We're a professional services company. We try to use automation to kind of do projects for our customers in a very structured way, and using automation in every phase of the workflow to try and speed it up, to try and get better quality. And so we've been pretty successful at that. I lead the automation team there at EIA. So we're basically a group of um, network engineers that have moved into kind of this software development, network automation phase. And that's really what we do for our clients. Just go in, understand what needs to be done, what time frame it needs to be done in, and then we work out a process and we see where we can automate any part of it. Like I said, to it's not so much speed usually, although it started out actually as speed. But a lot of it now is more to do with quality and repeatability and just making sure that all the steps get done. I think we all know, especially network engineers who are very busy, network engineers who primarily operate the network and then kind of do design, kind of the second, sort of a secondary duty. A lot of times we're pressed for time, and sometimes you know what you're doing. You know your network. You maybe skip a step that is not that critical. Really try to use automation to never skip any steps.
Gotcha.
So mhm.
And is business good? I'm hoping that it's going well.
Business is going very well. Yes.
All right. Happy to hear because I mean we're with evangelizing and advocating for network automation, so it's always nice to see folks that are making it happen in real life. So I'm super glad to have you on this stream. What about your background a bit? What do you want to share with folks? So how did you get to this point in your career? Like we've had folks here from all types of backgrounds, with all types of education, right? So I was just curious if you want to share with folks, like, how did you get to the current point in your career? Were you always like in, computer science, networking, or you kind of got converted along the way?
So I don't know if it's a funny story, but like you said, I think you've had people here from unimaginable walks of
Yeah.
life. I started out, um, you know, child of the space program, right? Wanted to be an astronaut. Studied aerospace
Oh,
in college. And for me, computer science was always kind of like a side hobby. When my computer science teacher went on medical leave in high school, I got to teach the class. Um, that kind of stuff, right? It was always a hobby. In university, computer science was my hobby, not my main major. And then I was fortunate enough to get a job at NASA's Jet Propulsion
Mm,
Laboratory, and I actually worked for the department that gets a lot of the images back from basically those space probes and manipulates them. You've seen the
mhm.
mosaics, right? Mapping out, areas of Mars or wherever we happen to be. And so I got a job there as a software developer, and started things out, and started working on applications that needed to work across the network. So I like went to the next building over where I knew the networking team, lived, and started out trying to find out, okay, how can I make my application work better? Um, and I kind of got sucked into the networking team.
They like,
um,
yeah,
yep,
they got you
that was
right.
pretty
That
much
was
it.
once you saw it, and it's like no more sneaker net. Let's figure this thing out.
Yeah, and then I got to know all the guys, and eventually a spot came open, and one of the guys, like, hey, we got a spot open. What do you think about coming over? Talk to the boss, and that started my kind of network engineering career. But I always loved scripting. I am not a software developer. I know enough to be dangerous. So wherever, back then it was like expect and
Mhm.
bash scripts and,
Tickle,
Perl. Mhm.
yeah, some TCL like Tickle, right? It was like Tickle TK. I remember. Expect, yep.
Yep. Yep, exactly. So that was always kind of in the back of my mind. In 2014, 2015, at that point, I had moved to a company called Dimension Data, a big Cisco partner. They kind of don't exist anymore, or they're now NTT, I guess is a better way to phrase it. But at the time, we had a project to do refresh, basically kind of network modernization for a huge company. And you know how signing purchase orders and stuff can take a long time. And so by the time we actually were able to start working, it had eaten into like 3 months of our timeline, and we had to hit a downtime that some of these sites were going to experience. They were going down for maintenance, and so we had to come in and do the refresh at that window. And that window wasn't moving, right? That window had been planned for like a
Mhm.
year. But what shrunk was our ability to actually execute. And luckily, my the lead at the time, I'm like, look, we're never going to be able to do this unless we start looking at maybe automating some stuff. So we brought in at the time the company had a DevOps team, so we brought in a DevOps engineer, and I wound up being the network engineer that kind of wrote the pseudo code. Okay, I need you to write something that does this and does that. And at that time, I was just starting to learn Python, so she really kind of helped me learn the language, because I would see, oh, okay, here's how she did this. And it was just so we were able to automate our way enough so that we could catch up a little bit time wise. We were automating the staging
Mhm.
process basically. Um, and so from that perspective, that was a speed thing, not so much a reproducible quality thing. It turned out to be that too, but the primary focus of that automation effort was, we have like 6 months of work to do, and we have 2.5 months to do it in. So basically that got me started. After that, I got a little more comfortable writing my own scripts, and that's basically how I got started with automation.
Nice. So that's around what, 10 years now? About? Yeah,
Yeah, as it turns out, that is like 10 years ago.
that's nice. All right. So what a journey, yeah. And now, so let's talk about a bit about this project today, right? That we're gonna show folks. So how did it come to be? Because I mean, I know, like you were saying, you're working with all these customers, and I would imagine you kind of start seeing some patterns into folks running into all types of issues, and they start. I would imagine that kind of right. There's commonality between all of them. Um, so tell us a bit about the project today and how it came to be and how come you decided to develop it.
So we do see, I know you see this too, right? It's like for any given enterprise network. So I should say that I'm very much in the enterprise space, not so much, not a service
Hmm.
provider. Most of the we work with are very much enterprise. And you just get a nice perspective, right, on kind of all the problems that everybody's trying to solve. And you both see how much is common, and I would say maybe like 75% is common. Um,
Hmm.
but it's that 25%, right? That's uniquely that client, right? That
Hmm.
winds up being the sticky part. I don't think I have to tell anybody, right, that changing VLANs on a port is just, it's mundane. It's not even remotely interesting, and everybody has to do it some of the time, all of the time. Um, so I think taking back a step, I saw Jeremy Schulman. I don't know if you know Jeremy.
Hmm.
So he did a talk at Interop. I don't know, probably 5 years ago, where they had a problem where their APs um, like had to get bounced, right? They were PoE devices, and an AP would kind of go offline, and so they wind up having to just turn the port off and on just to kind of recycle the AP. And he showed he demonstrated, right, how they did that, how his organization did that, and that just kind of floored me. And so that's always kind of in the back of my mind. What could we do to make the not just the operators, right, but the users' lives a little better? So with that in mind, fast forward like 5 years, and we're getting a lot in segmentation programs, right, trying to secure the network more and more. And one of the things that tends to happen with that, right, depending on the solutions, is you wind up having maybe a lot more VLANs at your location. And now, of course, people need to start moving things, right, into those VLANs. And now maybe before the VLAN was kind of infrastructure, but now the VLAN is tied to a firewall policy, right? So you have to be very deliberate about this device needs this kind of communication, and it has to go into this zone. And so what we've seen kind of broadly is just a huge uptick in, people needing to move ports around. And that's great. And if you have a big knock, and you can service those requests, within minutes, um, maybe something like this is needed. But from what I've seen, that's usually not the case. And so again, fast forwarding into some of the tooling that we have available today, one of the biggest problems with that I have seen, right, is it sounds easy to flip a port. And if you ask a network engineer, they're like, oh, why automate that? It takes me, 15 seconds. Well, maybe that's true. Maybe the actual typing, right, of the command takes you 15 seconds. But there's a lot more to it, right? You want to maybe understand, should this port move? Should it move into this VLAN? Is the VLAN even on the switch?
Hmm.
Is it working on the switch, right? I've seen, and I think we've all seen VLANs that maybe somehow got configured on the switch, but actually are not functional, right? But you see it on the switch, maybe you don't know to check, and you put your device on it, and now your device is black hole. So all those things kind of came into being, and it's like, okay, I think we can put enough guardrails around this function. I know this function, it's kind of a well-known activity. I've got it mapped out clearly. I know precisely what needs to be done. um, I have systems that can help me do that very easily. And so what you see here is sort of an example of something like this. This is just a couple of functions I pulled out, of an actual production system. But it's a demo. We'll share the link, right, Nadrian, with the
Yeah.
team, with everybody. Uh,
Yes.
and so it's sort of here's what it could look like. Letting your own users, or even a subset of users who are authorized, make their own changes. In this case, change the VLAN on a port can be done very safely with lots of guardrails, right? With lots of business logic kind of baked in. I hope I answered your question.
You did. You did. Thank you so much. All right. So that's one of them, right? And like you said, you're starting with something that's very common. Like a network person would change VLANs day in and day out, right? And then as you start thinking about it, there's all these guardrails that you need to put in place. Oh, does that VLAN exist? Oh, does it has is supposed to exist actually on that switch? Is it on the trunk, on the uplink trunk? Is it getting propagated? Right. So is it a restricted VLAN or not, right? Can it even be used for a user or printer, whatever it is, type of connection. So there's all these things that come into the picture that you have to keep in mind as you start automating and working on these types of projects. All right, so then let's have a lot of people here. Thomas, broadcast seems choppy and keeps stopping on LinkedIn. I'm not sure why that is happening.
Uh-oh.
It works well for me. I can see Claudia and I can hear her perfect. So I'm not sure if it's where's the bottleneck. Um, on YouTube, Twitch is not choppy on these platforms. Okay, so YouTube, Twitch, and X is not choppy on that. Thanks, Jock, for that. Um, AKPT on having captions available. We'll see if we can do this on the live stream. I know we'll do it on the recording, so we can enable that as this video is recorded and be available for playback. We'll enable captions on that. And then, well, Hakan, hello again. Hakan, thanks for joining from Turkey. Mario, good evening. So thanks, folks, for joining, everyone. So yeah, let's jump in now, Claudia, and kind of start sharing screen.
Okay.
Uh, and kind of start showing folks your repo, kind of the architecture of the solution of how all these components come together.
Okay. Am I sharing?
Yes.
All right. So, a couple things, just to backtrack a little bit back to the question you just asked me, right? I do want to emphasize that it sounds like a trivial problem, but it winds up
Mm-hmm.
not being a trivial problem. We'll get to that in a moment. But I did want to kind of talk about. I have a definition of network automation that I always use whenever we're kind of looking at a new project, and for me, network automation is all about providing kind of a service that can be consumed by many. Not, in this case, we're talking about a service that can be consumed by our users, which can be scary, to be sure. Um, but also, one of the things that I will tell you has happened is so we showed this, right? And we have this available. And then a project comes along and says, you guys being the network, right? You guys are a key part of our project. We're rolling out, say, digital signage systems, at 50 sites around the world. And we have to ask you guys to change the ports, right? Well, with a system, we don't even have to do that anymore. We could go in and change the ports ourselves. And then they're like, well, we want to automate that. But so how can we tap into your API? So from now, with this definition, at least in my mind of network automation, I'm always thinking about, okay, what if it's not a human at the other end that needs to consume this capability, right? What if it's another program? And so that's really kind of elevating my skills. It's also showing me that maybe for a big enough project, we need to bring in like a developer. It's not going to be me. Or a team of people to help put the system together. So I really like thinking of network automation this way because, like I said, it gets me to think about the things that are possible. This is great, right? Don't get me wrong. People are like, oh, wow, I can do my own port changes within this set of criteria. That's fabulous. It does tremendous for customer satisfaction, right? They control their own destiny. They don't have to call the help desk or call the knock or anything like that. It's just wonderful, right, to see the uptake there. But if you take it to the next step, wow, I want other projects who need network services to be able to tap into this type of service.
Hmm.
And so, one of my kind of challenges for this little repository is to actually put an API in front of it. But
Gotcha. I mean, yes, that's definitely. I like how you're evolving, right? Your ideas exactly like how you should.
I hope
So you're
so.
starting from a user perspective, and then it's like, oh, but hold on, because I need an API now. So you need to add an API on top of it, and then you need to make that API, secure. So authentication. You need to have it probably like a Swagger-based API,
Yeah.
right? So that it's kind of self-documented as you write the code, and the API gets nicely documented. So I like it. I love it how you're evolving this.
Well, it is definitely a work in progress, I'll tell you. But the biggest challenge, also let me back up and say most we I started out with, okay, I just need to change VLAN.
Hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to go to headquarters. I'm going to pick a switch. And notice that nowhere in here am I actually entering anything. One of the things we found out is you really want to try and keep user input to an absolute minimum, like avoid it at all costs. Um, so because now every selection is sort of curated. So let's say I just want to go to this switch and this port, and here are all the VLANs that are available on that switch. So let's
Hmm.
say I want port 5 to go over to the digital signage VLAN. Okay, so it's going to tell me, okay, I've got other ports on that VLAN. Okay, that's good. It's doing a critical VLAN check. So we'll get to this in a minute because this is where business requirements start to kind of have to be folded in to safely do this. So I have is this a critical VLAN? And however the enterprise wants to define a critical VLAN, that's fine. Um, it's on VLAN 1 right now, not a critical VLAN. It's moving. I want to move it to VLAN 10, also not a critical VLAN.
Hmm.
Um, when I mentioned that this came out of like a production system, so I left some of the checks that we do in here, but on the back end, we're using SusieQ open source to do a lot of these checks. The SusieQ open source doesn't have a spanning tree module. The enterprise does. So here, if I wanted to use open source, I'd probably kind of just roll my own spanning tree check. I
Hmm.
would definitely check spanning tree, right? That was one of our guardrails because we have seen enough instances where the VLAN is configured on the switch, but it's not actually functional.
Hmm.
So let's just say this is for demo, and then the user has to confirm that they want to change gig 105 from VLAN 1 to new VLAN 10. So I'm going to go ahead and change the port. And it's going to go again through all the checks we've talked about. And I'll go over there in a moment. But it's gone through, it's created a change request. It's basically put together the payload that needs to be sent to the switch. It's showing you wouldn't necessarily expose this to the user. They don't know or care, right?
Hmm.
But for the audience here, I figured they might want to see. So this is going to SusieQ and pulling the current information of the port. Now I'm using NetMiko, pretty simple, very mature, well thought out library to get to your switches. It's going to push that payload we crafted, putting the interface on VLAN 10. Now it's going to go back and get the new configuration of the VLAN, which is now VLAN 10, and we're good. On the back end,
This is the ticket that got created over there in ServiceNow, right?
yeah, you can see I've been practicing all morning. So, and full disclosure, what ticket number was it actually? 3012.
Thirty
So
thousand twelve.
here's, yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, yeah. So here's the ticket we just created. I am using a developer instance of ServiceNow. It's a wonderful thing. If you're seeing with ServiceNow, you want to kind of delve into this. It is great. You can get one for free. You spin it up. It lasts. It's based on usage. I think it lasts like a week, maybe. I can't remember. If you use it, it'll continue to live. If you stop using it, eventually it'll age out. And that's all that this is. It took minutes, right, to spin it up. So we'll look at the code here in a minute. So we've done a ticket. We've essentially fulfilled this request. And that's all the user would have to do. It's fully documented, right? We've checked. So let's talk about the checks. So I got to the habit of asking every client that I talk to, I think I have it down here, under what circumstances would you allow your users to change ports? And sometimes you're like, no, never. So then at that point, you have to propose, you have to like enumerate. And so that's usually what I get. And then I'll say, okay, well, what if we lived in a world where uh, I could tell you if the VLAN was working, I could tell you if the VLAN was on the switch. Maybe you don't want to get into trunking, although I will tell you that a lot of times that's where something like this is headed, because what this doesn't address is I need this port on this VLAN, and the VLAN hasn't been provisioned down there yet. There's
Hmm.
no reason why you can't do it. And in fact, we do. The question is, do you want to expose that to your users? I get there's a little people are wary of that, but that's kind of where it's going. Process, right? That every network engineer does all the time, especially if you're in the enterprise or data center. But so these are the common guardrails or business logic that enterprises tell us. Okay, well, I don't want every user, to do it. You need to be like authorized in the system, and so usually it winds up being like the IT support at the location, right? That's fair, right? Sometimes they want a user to be authorized at a specific location, right?
Hmm.
I can only make changes to headquarters, right? I can't make changes to any other site. Those are the kinds of things. You already saw we really want to minimize manual input. First types of things that we do this when users had to type stuff in is a mess. Don't do
Yeah.
it, please. Let me be your cautionary tale. Just don't do it. um, the VLAN must exist and it must be functional, right?
Hmm.
Here's a tricky one. Only user ports can be changed. Well, how do you determine a user port? Every enterprise is different. Um, Maybe you have an enterprise that always gets uplink modules, right? So you can actually weed out the uplink ports. But some enterprises don't, right? Some enterprises will have, 48 port switch, and the last, 6 ports are for infrastructure. You just don't know. So that is logic that will have to be kind of purpose built. I've been lucky. We work with a lot of Cisco shops. Most of the clients we work with, right, either by modules. There are ways to figure out what a user port is, but that's a tricky one. Um, then this one I never even thought about until we got into it. There are VLANs I don't want anybody to change. Server VLANs. We'll have an example here. In fact, let's say that I wanted to change this port to VLAN 30. So VLAN 1 is okay. VLAN 30 is a critical VLAN. It's a building automation VLAN, and self-service is not allowed. Those are the kinds of guardrails I was talking
Hmm.
about. There are many others we've had. You know what? I just want the people with we use Dell laptops, or whatever the laptop vendor happens to be in the enterprise. We just want the Dell laptops. And so, you know, vendor OUI, or we've seen the flip side, right? We just want the IoT to be able to move around. Those are the kinds of things, right, that you kind of have to ask and you have to think about. There may be switches that you don't want to have available for self-service, right? So you have to weed those out. And here's the tricky part. Oh, well, before I go there, we don't want to see any LDP or CDP neighbors on that port. If we see an LDP neighbor on that port, we're going to abort something. It's not a user port, right? Or
Right.
why does this
Device.
user, right? And we weed out phones, but why does this user have a non-phone CDP neighbor? So
It's like
something's up.
could be a security problem at that point, right? So kind of detect that way. It's like, oh, this person actually connected, off the shelf type of switch or something, and you're trying to
Right.
extend the network at
Yep.
their desk or something. Those types of situations, right? We get into um, security issues at that point.
Exactly. The other one is if we see multiple Macs, right? Because not everything is going to talk CDP or LLDP. So that's another guardrail that we've had to implement. If we see multiple Macs on this port and it's supposed to be a user port, and and it's not a phone, right? Phones are a different thing. But um, the other kinds of things is if I can't find the device, well, then what switch and port? It's kind of a non-starter. And then, of course, how do you handle changing? How does the enterprise want to handle the change? Open the ticket, execute the change, test, close the ticket. Some will say, open the ticket. I want you to automate that, but then we just want to make sure everything's good. So we'll go back in and close it ourselves, right? It's just going to be what each particular enterprise wants to do. So we spent a lot of time understanding under what circumstances would they be comfortable letting users change ports.
Or IT admins at sites, right? Or
Yep,
right, it depends
yep,
from enterprise to enterprise, I would imagine.
exactly. Some are like, sure, you build me enough, safety nets, I'm okay. And you see all the, if it's not in general, if it's not the way we expect things to be, we abort. And then, we
Right.
just say a message, I'm sorry, this is what we found. Please, call the help desk kinds of things. But if that's, even if that's like 20%, that's 80% of port flips you've managed to not just get off your Knox plate, right? But you've made the site, or at least certain IT, like you said, managers or IT people at the site kind of in charge of their own destiny, right? Not have to wait for anything or anybody, which is very nice. So, but we found out, right? So we started with change the VLAN, and you saw how that worked, right? And we check things, except what we figured out was users don't typically know what switch and port they're on, right? We would get things like I'm on Jack 7. I
Mhm.
I don't have any idea what Jack's, some enterprises have beautifully mapped out structured cabling. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you know exactly where it is. Um, but some don't. And so when you're in a situation where the user tells you don't have that way to map that, well, then what do you do? So if you notice, the change VLAN section is secondary. The first section is find the device, right? So
Mhm.
basically, let me see if my devices haven't timed out. So you pick a location, and then this is about the only input that this system allows. You can either put in a fully qualified domain name, a MAC, or an IP. And so everything starts with, can I find the device? So we didn't find this one. I think some of my systems have timed out. Let's see if I have another one. The camera. Sorry, I know I'm cheating, but I figured you really don't want to watch me type in IPs or Macs.
It's all good. There you
Okay.
go.
Yep. Okay. So in the protection system, again, we do a lot with Cisco. So device tracking is a beautiful thing, right? And ARP snooping, or DHCP snooping, I should say, but device tracking does it all, right? If you're not familiar with device tracking on your Cisco switches, it's a good idea to look into. One of the things we found, I mentioned we've been doing a lot of segmentation work, is that obviously, so you're building out new security zones and you're putting them behind a firewall, and sometimes the networking team doesn't have access to the firewalls, and so guess what? I've lost my ARP table, right? The thing I use all the time to figure out what MAC it is, right? Hunt it down on the network. Well, I don't have access
Hmm.
to that anymore. Well, enabling device tracking actually gives you that. It's a wonderful your switch. So whether it's ARP, which now tells you, oh, okay, that's probably statically IP'd, or if it says it's DHCP, well, you know that device is getting its IP address via DHCP. Having an understanding of how your end device is getting its IP is a wonderful thing, especially if you're trying to move it to someplace else, right? So I don't show it here, but we do a lot of that to try and figure out how the device is getting IP. If for no other reason than after I move it, if it's getting DHCP, I should be able to figure out what IP it got and ping it. So imagine the port change, or I even test the device afterwards. Pretty powerful stuff. So, but in this case, the open source version of SUSE doesn't do device tracking. The enterprise version does. So I left it in here because I wanted to talk about how powerful device tracking is. But in this little demo, it's disabled. But we know it's on VLAN 30. VLAN 30 is a critical VLAN. It's building automation critical. I'm not going to be able to, I know I'm not going to be able to do anything with this because, and I'll show you here in a moment, one of the things that we're using, so you might want to, I mentioned a lot of these guardrails. Where do you put that kind of information, right? Where do you put VLAN 30 is a critical VLAN? I mean, sure, you could put it in the name, but what if people don't name it right? It's an interesting topic. And I don't know if anybody has heard about InfraHub. It's a product from OpsMill, and it is all about not just putting your source of truth, whatever that happens to mean to you, or sources of truth to be more accurate. But this is also a place where you could store things like that. And so if you can see my screen here, under network
Hmm.
configuration, under VLANs, we've got my lab, I call it Underwater Corporation, and I've got basically building automation cameras. And in the source of truth system for VLANs and use, I have it named as critical, or I could actually have my own column, right, that says critical or, self-service available, whatever you need it to say. And so this is where the system is figuring out that it's a critical VLAN.
Gotcha.
So
So this could be like a NetBox, also the same thing. Could be a Cisco Catalyst Center, whatever your source of truth is, like you said.
exactly. And so whatever that particular element, but so in this system, there's a couple of elements that we've talked about already. Um, Obviously, there's code, right? Um, it's a GitHub repository in this case. Your enterprise might be GitLab, whichever revision control system you guys, your enterprise happens to use. We've already talked. We need a ticketing system because we want to document every single change. It's even more important, right, that I document this because now I've got people that are actually part of the networking team making network changes. So you saw the developer's instance of ServiceNow, super easy to spin up and use. Observability systems, so we're using SUSE for the demo. We tend to use, we started out using SUSE open source too, but once we understood kind of some of the additional features that were available for us, it was spanning tree is a big one. And also an ability to kind of craft like database types of merges. I won't get into that too much, but it's an observability system. Whichever one you have out there, that's where you start putting in your guardrails, right? But the intent data store is actually the one that we're using InfraHub here right? And that is VLAN 30 is a critical VLAN. How do I figure that out in a very deliberate and structured way? We've used SuzyQ Enterprise because it has that database capability, but Opsmill InfraHub really is, in this demo, what we're using, and it's kind of purpose-built for that kind of thing. I will be honest, 5 years ago, I would have been putting that stuff in a JSON file or a YAML file, right? Just have a list of VLANs, and they were critical, and I put it under a vision control, and then every time I ran my script, I'd have to load that in and see if, it was a critical VLAN. Streamlit, also a really useful utility. If you haven't run into it, it's incredibly easy to spin up a front end. So it's what I'm using as the web server. This is Streamlit. Usually
That's
you can
pretty
see
cool.
all of
For front end, it looks pretty customizable.
it is, and it's got an add-on, kind of a bolt-on module. This is great for demos. In production, we don't use this, right? Production, we're hitting, Active Directory usually, or some kind of LDAP store, right? For the to figure out who you are and what you're supposed to be able to do. But for a demo, it actually gives you a lot. You can load in your passwords. You can pre-authorize people. You can manage, right? So those are the three things I wanted to kind of show in the demo, right? You've got to figure out where the device, first of all, you have to log in, right? It's important that you should be making these changes, especially if you're not part of the networking team. You got to figure out where the device is, and then obviously figure out where you want to move it to. Always trying to minimize any user input. So those are the kind of the building blocks of this system. Is it time to look at code?
Yes, let's have a look at code.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is fantastic because, I mean, if you think about it, right, what you would have to do if you wouldn't have this interface, as first of all, you wouldn't want to give access to the device to folks to connect to. So, you don't want to spread credentials, right, SSH credentials to all your infrastructure to folks. So, you kind of hide that behind the fact that you give them a front end, you have a drop down list with the devices, right? They don't need to even know credentials for those switches, right? So you can manage credentials for those separately. They just need access to the interface here, like you were showing, right? You create a user for them here. And then in the background, you can abstract them from them. They don't need access at all to the device, right? They don't need, and they have only curated access to the device. They can only see VLANs, interfaces, right? And then choose from drop down lists, no free text type of fields over
Exactly.
there, because that's gonna be a recipe for disaster.
Yes. Again, use me as a cautionary tale, please. But this is SuzyQ open source, so you can
Mm-hmm.
see here are so in here what I've done is a namespace is a particular region, right? And so once you go to the the front end, you can see that I have those three regions. I'm getting those real time from SuzyQ. I'm hitting the SuzyQ API, and I'll get every namespace that's available. So Asia, Middle East, and then headquarters. And then once I pick a region, I'll do it over here. Once I pick a region, I will actually just get the switches that are available in that region. So you notice I have Pacific, Oceans, and Atlantic. And you can see here, headquarters has those three switches.
Mm-hmm.
Pacific, Oceans, and Atlantic. And so at every step of the way, right, if it's a 24 port, I'll only be able to pick 24 ports, right, or however many user ports I've decided that particular switch has. But you get the idea. And then once I pick the switch, it automatically tells me, okay, these are the VLANs that are configured on that switch. So it's all real time. At every step of the way, I'm getting the very latest information. And to your point, I'm actually not logging into the switches to do it. I'm logging into the observability system to get all of that information.
Nice.
Okay, so we were going to look at code.
And this
So,
is all shared in the repo, folks, by the way. So as you take this, right, and you start implementing it or have a look at it, you can modify, right, Claudia? By the way,
absolutely.
do you take PR, like pull requests on this if folks want to contribute back or want to do
Oh,
improvements?
I would be very happy. Yes.
Okay.
That would be amazing. I mean, in the hope that if nothing else, like Jeremy's talk for me, right, it kind of sparks an idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has slightly different or largely different problems to solve, right? But at the end, for networking people like us, it's kind of like the space, right? And so you never know where an idea is going to kind of go, hey, now that I like Streamlit, right? Streamlit started out, it started out life as a way to visualize. It's a data analysis tool, right? People wanted to share data sets and they wanted to kind of put a pretty front end on pandas and spin it up as in a GUI because everyone knows how to, deal with a GUI. I'm like, hey, this is just running a really simple web server. In fact, if you go over here, I'm just going to break out of it. We'll get an error here that, see how it says connecting because I killed it. This is literally all you need to do. Streamlit run your Python script. It'll pop open a
That easy.
browser.
Wow.
It is that simple. So this is the script that I run. It's this one's pretty simple. Another option, if you're looking at kind of web server type things, Solera is also very good. Streamlit has been around for a bit longer. Solera, I'm not going to say it's prettier, right? But it has a very appealing interface. I tend to go over, oh, and I will tell you that it handles state, which is every one of these is like a form. And one of the things that happens is if you leave the form, you lose your data. So you wind up having to kind of save your data so you can transfer it. You saw over here in change VLAN, if I find a device, I could actually say use the results from find my device and it'll automatically populate what you found in here for the port change. To do that, you have to carry all the information that you found. And so you wind up handling the session state, a lot. It took a while for me to figure it out, but now that I get it, it's like second nature. Solera handles that a little bit more cleanly. I still use Streamlit because Streamlit does has a lot of features for like displaying text that I really like.
Mm-hmm.
Solera doesn't have quite as many, at least not yet. So that's why I use Streamlit still. There's a couple things. It's like super simple. I'll use Solera for, but this is what you see here. I'm just initializing a bunch of things I know I'm going to have to carry across my pages. And so you see a folder called pages and it's got these things. Find my device is its own script. Change VLAN is its own
Mm-hmm.
script or page. And then the password management is its own as well. So this guy is very, very simple. I like to leave these print statements in here as examples because sometimes you're not quite sure how to get to the data you need, right? You're getting back these complex data structures, highly nested, lists of dictionaries, of lists. Um, and so I like to leave these in here in the repositories that I share just to give you a sense of like how, right, to get to some of that data. So you can see here, Streamlit session state with a key of authentication status. That's always going to tell me if I'm logged in. And you can see that the first thing that happens is check if you're logged in. A lot of this stuff is just presentation. I like to leave the log out button available. I like to flip the images, just silly stuff like that, right? We check to make sure that we've got our API token for Suzy Q. There's a couple of other tokens. So I'm a big fan of using environment
Mm-hmm.
variables to store your sensitive information. And if you look at the repo, you will see this .env_sample file that should be turned into just a get rid of the underscore sample. And then you have your virtual variables here, and you can update as you see fit, right? You can see that I've got the ServiceNow personal developer instance information. I've got the infra hub, right? Because in this demo, we're hitting basically 3 APIs: SuzyQ, ServiceNow, infra hub. And then, of course, at the end, when we make the change, we're logging into a device. And if you can put everything in here, you can basically make sure that nobody can access this file. And then you don't have to deal with typing in passwords and keys, especially API tokens. Yuck. Okay. So the main file is pretty simple, and it's just kind of setting up the environment. This is the main file. It just tells you that it found the SuzyQ token. We're not going to get far, right? If we can't log into SuzyQ to check all of our state, and then it just is showing you this. The next find my device file, you'll start to see this pattern. We have to make sure that we're authenticated.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have to make sure that we have the state variables that we want to use to keep data. And so once we're authenticated, we come in here, and this, I mentioned the namespace list, right? So now this is how I get the locations. This list here becomes this pull down. And then you can see that it's giving me some tips on what to do, but you see it says saying select location, and that's exactly what you see here. And then the list, and the index is none, which means I'm going to make you pick one. Defaults are tricky. I should have said that before, right? Try not to default anything, because users, right? Oh, okay, that's a default. Sure, I'll go with that. Not such a great strategy when you're trying to change network interfaces. Okay, and then the single text input that we have, right, is either the fully qualified domain name, the IP, or the MAC. And I'm sorry, I mean, I do a bunch of checking, right, to make sure, okay, I think this is an IP, I think this is a MAC. And then we'd also spend a lot of time. One of my biggest pet peeves is when people don't normalize the MACs, right? Because you get MACs in every possible way. You get MACs, with periods, with colons, uppercase, lowercase.
Dashes, whatever.
Thank you. Dashes, if somebody copies it from a Windows system. I got a Mac the other day without any delimiters whatsoever, and I will be the first to tell you my script crashed. And the guy's like, hey, that's a perfectly valid Mac. I'm like, yeah, I just didn't know I was going to get a Mac without any delimiters. But that's exactly what will happen. And so you can see here all the different things that I'm going to try and find out about that device, right? It's IP. It's no matter what you give me, I'm going to try and find out if it's got a fully qualified domain name, right? I'm going to try and find out its MAC. MAC being the most important because the MAC lets me map it to a port, right? So all of this is just trying to figure out, what did I get? And based on what I got, how can I figure out the rest of it? So I know we're running short on time. I will tell you that this file and the change VLAN file are essentially just tapping into this utilities Python. It's just a set of all these functions that I figured out I need. Like SuzyQ gives me time. When was the last time that this device was seen on the network? In Unix time. Well, no one knows what that is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I have to translate the SuzyQ timestamp into human readable and local. Or
Mm-hmm.
in other versions of this, right? I have human readable, and GMT, whatever makes sense. Guess what this one does, right?
Get names.
This one gets me, right? So it's hitting the REST API for namespace. I want the latest, right? I could actually say, get me the namespace as it was a month ago, right? But who wants to do that? But and then the rest of it is just, if I get a 200, okay, that's good. I probably got a response, right? If my response.json has stuff in it, right? I can develop that list. So all of these are functions that get called in both of these, in find my device and change VLAN. And we can just go through here and you can see this critical
VLAN
check
check. Yeah.
critical VLAN. So I have I mentioned there was an instance of this where I did it with SuzyQ, but that was SuzyQ Enterprise. This time we're using it with InfraHub. So this is the function that I have. So I load my variables, and you guys saw in the .env file, right?
Mhm.
That's basically the endpoint that I want to hit in InfraHub. InfraHub uses GraphQL. It's different. Think of it as another version of REST in one sense. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's basically how you get to the data in your InfraHub system. I want to pull all the VLANs, and then I'm looking at if the role is critical and if it's the VLAN I care about. Because if you notice, there's one thing I pass is a VLAN. So this is basically a function that's going to go into InfraHub and tell me if the VLAN I am sending to it is a critical VLAN, which means in the way I set things up here, if it's role,
Mhm.
and then
That's
I'm going to,
basically a tag in InfraHub at that point.
yep, yep. And so I have a set of variables, right? In a response dictionary that I built. I do this a lot because sometimes there's a lot of stuff you want to send over, right? It's sometimes not as simple as just, I could just send over is critical. But for example, if it is critical, then I want to basically print out a bunch of stuff. But since I'm calling this over here and change my VLAN, I don't want to have to keep doing this. So I build this little dictionary of all the stuff that I might need over in the other script. And then I return that response dictionary. So if we go over to change VLAN, and if I check to see that the VLAN is critical, you notice if critical VLAN dictionary, that's the dictionary I passed in. If is
Mhm.
critical is true, then I basically spit out an error and I halt execution.
Nice. And there was a question that came through here, Claudia from AKPD on YouTube. Can you elaborate a bit on why not have default values?
Oh, because if you remember who might be using the system, they may not know, right? And so if you have, I'm saying like don't have a default switch, that kind of stuff. Some default values are okay. But let's say you put in a default switch and someone's not quite sure what they're doing. And so they just take the default. And now maybe you've changed a port on a switch that, you know, was not the right switch. So maybe I shouldn't say don't have default values, but think about what people might do if you do have default values, right?
When you
So
put guardrails in place, just keep in mind that also, right? Yeah, just be mindful of it.
yes, build your system. I was gonna say bring your 10-year-old in and to kick the tires on it, but they probably they probably get it. But um, a lot of times, like for example, like big sites have their IT resources, and so there's a couple people there that kind of understand IT. But let's say you have a small office, and really you have like an office administrator, right? If you put in a default value as your office administrator, going to know, without training, going to know if that's actually the right thing. It is a multi-layered kind of approach, right? If it's an actual office administrator changing ports, he or she probably should just have access to like the one switch they can make changes on, and then it becomes a moot point. So it's just something to think about.
Exactly. Uh, all right. So, I mean, we're top of the hours. Claudia, anything that you want to cover, kind of like last thoughts, suggestions,
Well, I hope
wishes?
I hope this is sparking ideas about what you could do. I hope that you can start to maybe make a case for giving your users a little bit more self-determination in the networking world, right? Because I do think we have the systems now that can support that safely. Um, the other thing I would mention, right, just to conclude on lessons learned, be prepared to be wildly successful, right? Like I said, the next thing was, okay, this is great if you're a user, but I have this program and I want to use
Hmm.
your service, but I can't use a web interface, right? I need an API for me to use it because I want to automate my stuff, right? So is your solution programmatically consumable for others? Um, and and this is a lesson learned from Cisco ACI, right? So I'm a big fan of ACI, and one of the things I first loved is the APIC just makes REST calls. The
It's
APIC
all
can make REST,
APIs.
yeah. And the most wonderful thing of all is they actually expose the calls. You can run a little window, and as you're
Hmm.
clicking around doing your thing, it actually shows you all the commands that the controller is sending. And so I always kind of challenge myself. That is a system worth building, right? That's a system that's going to grow.
Exactly.
Um,
Go with the API first mindset, right? That's the thing. Have it
exactly.
available over the API, and then consumers. It could be your front end, like Streamlit. It could be whoever, not another piece of program. But as long as your API first, then you're golden.
Exactly. And so that will be my challenge, right? In fact, you see down here, my next step is to actually reformulate this with an API. The one thing I also do want to mention, so be prepared for the guardrails to grow, but also
Hmm.
to diminish. So in the first system we built, we were told, I only want to support moving a Mac that's been on this port for a month. Sounded reasonable. Okay, so that this thing isn't moving around all over the place, right? That's probably the port, where the user sits, right? They don't so that made sense. And the first thing we ran into was like, well, no, it's new. I just got it. It hasn't been around for a month. It's my new laptop. So that's what I mean. The guardrails
Hmm.
might start out one way, might grow because you'll hit something, or might diminish. And the diminishing is good, right? Because that starts to tell you that there's confidence in the system and in kind of the way you've deployed this, and the checks and balances that you're putting in. And so taking those taking those some of those rules out of the system is definitely a good thing. Authorization and authentication is tricky. You will love the way Streamlit does it, but that's probably not the way you'll implement in real time. Rollback. You notice that the change VLAN does not have rollback, and it should. Oh, wrong port. Darn it. How do I put it back?
Hmm.
You already know about minimizing manual input. And then, of course, who is going to support this, right? You need to get it in a production setting, and who basically does the care and feeding. And this is an interesting problem for all of us as network engineers who are now moving into the automation space. I think at some point we're all going to have to decide: are we network engineers? Or are we software developers? I want to be both,
Yeah, it's
but
the lines are becoming blurrier and blurrier with every day, right? It's like
yeah,
as you start automating more, you get into software development more as network folks. It's like, yeah, it's kind of like a bit of an identity crisis also at some point.
yes.
Because historically networking folks have ran away from software development. So it's funny that the circle is kind of becoming complete. You're kind of getting sucked back into actually software development and scripting and writing Python. So it's interesting to see as how it evolved.
It really is. I have I work with an amazing team, and there are some brilliant network engineers, and they understand they want to consume network automation because it saves them time. They can run a lot more tests, than normally in much shorter times. So they see that value of it, but they don't want to have anything to do with building it. And then there's another, right? They're like, oh no, I love network engineering, right? But hey, okay, what about this Python stuff? Show me, Um, so it's kind of fun. It's network engineers that aren't seeing the value. I think that's our target audience now.
Yeah, and I mean, hopefully with streams like this, right, folks can see some of the advantages that automation brings. And I'm glad and happy to hear that you're successful and you have all these customers and interested in automation and doing all this cool stuff. So, Claudia, thank you so much for coming over. This was really fun. I hope you enjoyed it,
Absolutely.
folks. And yeah, if you want to come back, right, at any point, you have some other cool projects you want to share with us, we'd love to have you back. And folks, for all of you watching, thank you so much for being here, asking your questions. Hope you found this useful. See you on the next one. Will be probably after Cisco Live. We have Cisco Live coming up in Amsterdam in a couple of weeks or so. So we'll see you with a series of streams after that. In the meantime, watch the recordings of the previous ones. Get inspired, and thanks all for watching. See you folks on the next one. Claudia, any parting words?
No, everybody, thank you so much for your attention. Have a great time in Amsterdam.
For folks that are going. So
For folks that are going. I wish I were going with you.
yeah. All right. Take care, folks.
Bye bye, everybody.
Bye.